Hey guys, thanks for clicking into the video. In this one we're going to be going over the full build for the Arkham Knight helmet from the Batman Arkham Knight game. Please enjoy.
Alright guys, what's going on? So today we're going to be looking at the Arkham Knight helmet from the Batman Arkham Knight video game series. Personally, this is one of my favorite video games played, and the designs on both Batman and Arkham Knight both just seem really cool. So this was a real treat for us. Before we get started, however, I do want to say that this was a bit of a challenging print compared to others. And depending on what printer you have, you may need to print this helmet in sections. However, if you can, I would recommend you try print the helmet out as a whole. That way you don't have to worry about putting pieces together of the helmet in the end. For us, we have a CR-10S 3D printer, and that's what we used to print off this helmet, and it worked out just perfectly and fitted on the board nicely. Because we wanted to physically wear the helmet, we adjusted the sizing to make it slightly larger than the original size it had on the STL file. This did add time to the print, but overall it was really well worth it. So let's get started. First off, we adjusted the sizing of the helmet from about 210mm on the x-axis to about 230. This gave my head personally enough space in the opening of the helmet to fit through comfortably without giving any issues to myself or the helmet. We done this by simply clicking on the helmet, then coming over to the left hand side of the screen and then clicking on the scale icon. From here, you'll have your X, Y and Z axis. This is basically the overall sizing of the helmet. The helmet itself is a uniform structure, so if you change the X axis, the Y and Z axis changes uniformly with it. So from here, we simply change the sizing of the X axis from 210 to 230 and everything changes nicely with it. Next off, you'll notice the color has changed on the helmet, indicating that the overall print does not fit to scale on our print board, meaning we couldn't print by the way it was sitting on the board. This will be talked about later on in the video, but the next thing we done was we rotated the helmet slightly to the left, where the nose of the helmet and the corner of the board almost were in line with each other. This gave us enough space for the helmet to actually fit on the board then. Our next issue was how much supports we needed. As you can see at the bottom of the helmet, there's a lot of intricate little pieces of detail that looks like wiring or metal framework. Because of how flimsy these little pieces of detail can be on the helmet, we wanted to use as little support as possible to avoid damaging any of the detail in the future. We fixed this issue by rotating the helmet slightly onto its nose. This will allow the structure of the print to support itself as it's being printed, without using any extra supports that are unwanted. The other thing we done, which was talked about earlier, was that we rotated the helmet so that the nose or the front of the helmet was in line with the left hand corner of the board. This gave the helmet a little more space, which was needed for the slightly bigger sizing. Next, I'm just going to show quickly what we use for our print settings. So if you want to stop the video here quickly or pause it and have a quick look. For more information about the print settings, I highly recommend checking out Frankly Built on YouTube. So as you can see, there's only supports that are necessary around the bottom of the helmet to avoid any details. I also used support blockers in the center of the helmet to avoid extra or unwanted support going through the center of the helmet. Cura often puts the support in order to give extra support when printing. But I promise you, it's very rare that you'll need it when printing helmets, as everything on the helmet usually supports itself when building unless you have a major overhang somewhere.
So first we have the sanding, and to start off here we're using the machine sander with an 80 grit sandpaper to go over all the larger open parts. The reason for the machine sander instead of doing it all by hand is mainly for two things. The first is that if we were to try and sand this by hand, it would likely take you weeks to get it as smooth as the machine sander would. And secondly, because we want both the screen face of the mask and the metallic sides to look as realistic as possible. And in order to do this, we need them to be as smooth as possible. You'll see later on in the video that the smoothness of the finish will really dictate how your results come out. Also be careful if you're using a machine sander not to leave it sanding in the one spot for too long and to keep it constantly moving, otherwise it can actually cause the PLA plastic to melt instead of smoothing. And so this is the helmet with the bulk of the open spaces smoothed out, but with this particular helmet there are a lot of intricate details, especially along the sides, and those details will be lost to the machine sander, so we have the manual task of sanding by hand, which does take some time, but again, the more effort you put in here, the better your end result is going to be. I started the hand sanding with an 80 grit paper, but after this I went over it again with both a 180 grit and a 240 grit. Another tip for hand sanding and getting into those little nooks would be to wrap the sandpaper around a sponge or use one of those sanding blocks, which just makes it easier and isn't as rough on your hands, because this does tend to take some time. Once you've completed the first sanding, it's time to spray on the primer. The primer will act as an undercoat for the first layer of paint to stick to, but what it also does is it can fill in some of the more shallow layer lines that might have come out from your print. There are primer and filler mixed spray cans that you can get from the brand Rust-Oleum that you can order online, but with shipping and everything it ends up being pretty expensive. So as we're based in Ireland here, I'm just using a generic primer from a local hardware store, Woodies. However, I would not recommend this brand of primer. The reason for this is the can is very faulty and can cause the spray to come out in weird consistencies. So if you have another hardware store like Halford's nearby, I definitely recommend their own brand primer over this. It's basically the same price, €10 or less, if not cheaper, and from my experience has better results in consistency. In the case your print still has some gaps from layer lines and sanding, a quick and easy fix to allow for a smooth finish is using generic wood filler. With the paste you essentially pour it on and rub it into the gaps and spaces that you want to smooth over, but you need to be quick as it hardens quite quickly. Here I'm using a pretty excessive amount. That's not necessary, but it was my first time using it, and in this case I thought better too much and too little, as you'll be sanding it down again. Once the wood filler hardens and is filled in the gaps and lines, you can proceed to sand it down once again. And here you can see the finished and smoothed out helmet, and I'm also going to give it one final coat of primer just because a lot of it has been sanded off, and I want to go over the wood filler parts too. I would definitely say the hand sanding is the most tedious part, but this is a close second as we are now going to apply the masking tape to separate the two different color portions of the helmet. Luckily in this case there's basically just the two colors we're going to be spray painting, which are the metallic silver and the shiny blue face screen. For this it's again another case of how close and detailed you can get, the better and more accurate your lines are going to come out. I use a bag for both this part and the next to save tape, and saves a lot of effort that you don't need to mask the rest of it without tape. This is just a plastic bag going over the face. Just make sure there are no holes that the paint can get through and it should be all good to go. Moving on to the painting portion, for the sides of the helmet we're using Halford's own brand spray paint with the colour Metallic Black, which we've used on our previous Batman Hellbat build, and it contains little bits of almost glitter-like components which gives it a little bit of a shine. We gave this 2 coats of spray, and with the paint I would only give it an hour to dry before removing the tape. The reason for this is if you leave the paint to dry for too long, when you're removing the tape sometimes it can seep through a little bit of the lines. And this is probably the most satisfying part of any helmet build, is the removal of the tape and just praying that the paint didn't seep through anywhere. So you can see here the lines came out really well, and next we're going to apply the masking tape to the opposite side. Some people might say, why didn't you just spray the whole thing the one colour to be able to save the effort of doing both parts with masking tape? But my argument for this is that the bottom layer wouldn't be primer and you'd be spraying paint on top of paint, so it won't have the same finish. And in this case, we're also going to be doing something a bit different to allow for a shiny blue screen face and to try to make it look as reflective as possible. The first base layer we're going to spray the face with is this silver chrome paint, which will act as an undercoat for the blue colour we have to help boost the sheen of the colour. We give it a healthy coat on the chrome and let it sit for about 45 minutes before applying a light coat of the metallic blue enamel spray paint. Now make sure to go light with these coats with the blue spray paint so as it works together with the undercoat. With each light coat I waited about 45 minutes and would apply another light coat, so in total I gave it about 3 coats of the blue paint. The reason I'm using enamel spray paint instead of regular spray paint is because enamel spray paint I think is used more frequently on cars, so the finish it gives looks more metallic and shiny as opposed to a matte finish, so for a build like this it's more ideal. To finish off the face, we used a lacquer to give it a shinier finish. You can buy gloss sprays with super shiny finish, which I would highly recommend for this because we want it to look as reflective as possible, but in my case all I could get my hands on was lacquer and semi-shine gloss, so I just went with the lacquer. So this is what the helmet looks like after removing the masking tape. You could easily leave it here as is and it'd be a finished product, but I always like to add a little more detail to my helmet's build and make it look a little more worn and exposed. For this I use a silver acrylic paint, and just with a brush I hand paint some of the more exposed corners and parts like little bolts on the side. With this, don't be afraid to get a little messy. You can have some tissue or even use your hands to smudge out some of the lines, but typically I'll paint onto the parts that stick out the most. So there you have it, the finished build of the Arkham Knight helmet. I hope you guys enjoyed. Please feel free to check out our other build videos and be sure to like and subscribe for more content. Thank you.